I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our Luminary talk, Dave Bunnell. And Dave, most of you probably know Dave. He really needs no introduction, so I'm going to keep it very short. But Dave was the NSS news editor for 26 years and stepped down, I think, earlier this year. And or early in 2022, and he's a well-known, probably one of the best-known cave photographers that we've got anywhere on the planet. He's written books, he's done seminars, he's done workshops, etc. And I'm going to keep it short right there. But thank you very much, Dr. Dave Bunnell.
Okay, so this is my special little font here that I call stalactite. Okay, well, originally my theme was going to be all the world's a cave, because I've tried to cave all over the world in my years, but I realized that this year I'm celebrating 50 years of being a caver. So I invited this group of zombie cavers to celebrate with me for 50 years under the earth. And I'm considering making a book with that title, because one of the classic French speleologists made one called 10 Years Under the Earth. So I've been waiting for this moment. So I was raised by parents who there were 5 of us, all boys, and my parents were not outdoorsy people. They never took us backpacking or hiking, really. Every year they went to the Jersey Shore, and that was our big trip. But when I was about 10 or 12, they took my older brother on a trip to Virginia. We were in Delaware, by the way. And they went to Luray Caverns and came back with these little photos of it. And I saw them, and I was so jealous. I said, hey, I want to go to a cave. And so I got a chance. A few years later, I did, in 6th grade, I did a report on, we had to do one on a national park, and mine was on Acadia National Park. So my parents said, well, we'll take you on the next trip. And we went to Acadia National Park in Maine, which has this sea cave, Anemone Cave. And the thing's only about 60 feet deep, but it had all this nice tide pool life in it. And I took a whole roll of pictures in this cave. I went every day. And then we got home, and I was super excited. I put it in a mailer and was going to send it off to the processor. But I somehow left it sitting on my mom's car, and she drove off. And the next thing I know, I walked out in the street, and it had been run over. So it was not an auspicious start as a cave photographer. When I was 16, my friend of mine, who's an only child, was going out west, and his parents invited me to come along as his best friend. And we went to this cave in Sequoia Kings Canyon called Crystal Sequoia. And this wasn't taken then, this was taken more recently, but it did have this spider gate even back then. But I took only one picture in the cave, apparently, and this was it with the show cave lighting. So nominally, this is my first ever picture in a cave. So I didn't go very far afield to go to university. I went to University of Delaware. But very early on, I fell in with the with UDOC, University of Delaware Outing Club, and I became a rock climber. That was my passion initially, and I had some very strange outfits. Oops. Even more stylish. And all I can say is I'm lucky I didn't kill myself in those first few years, because some of the climbs we did But the other thing they did in the outing club was they offered caving trips. And there were a couple of girls I was really interested in, and I saw that they had signed up for them. So I thought, what the hell? Can't hurt, right? So I had this hard hat that didn't fit. It wiggled every time I moved, and I had this little lantern battery thing, and every time it tapped the rock, it would go on and off. So a lot of our trips were down to Seneca Rocks, and initially that was a place I went climbing. Oops. And this group that I had cave with from Delaware was, two of them are still caving, Ed LaRock on the left and Chuck Hoffman in the center there. I did a lot of other caves, but the one that really fascinated me was Hellhole, because it had this sign out in front that said, "Make peace with God." And so my dad had a plastics factory, and he said he could get me a rope, and he got me this weird 200-foot rope that was like all braided, and it was pure white, and I've never seen a rope like it, but it did get us down into Hellhole. And we were lucky. There was a sunbeam coming in, and this was actually the first shot that I entered in the photo salon in 1973. Or 4 rather. I founded the Caveless State Grotto early on, and it was just such a cool name, I couldn't let the fact that we had one cave dissuade me from it. But we went to this cave occasionally from Delaware. In fact, one night we left a party and stuffed like a dozen people into this cave. But I returned just a couple years ago with my older brother, and he wouldn't even go in the thing. So he took this picture of me back in there and with my lighting. Well, when it came time to apply to graduate school, of course my criteria for graduate education was, are there caves near the school? So I picked UVA Charlottesville. And the first night at the grotto meeting, they had a University of Virginia student grotto, and I met these 3 guys. We all went back to one of their apartments to share in a ritual. So a lot of you will know of Ron Simmons there on the left, and he became much more of a steady caving companion than the other 2. Over the years, we did a whole bunch of hard caving together, especially in West Virginia. But this is one of my favorite shots of hard-charging Ron coming out of a sump, and always accompanied by entertaining vocalizations. This is my girlfriend during the Virginia years, Fran, and we did a lot of trips to local caves. At the Texas convention in '78, I met Carol Vesely. She was actually tossed into my arms. I was in the river, and Chuck Hempel said, "We have to sacrifice a maiden to Ostotal." And he picked her up, and he came over to the edge of the river, and he said, "Who will accept this sacrifice?" And I swam over, and I said, "I will." And so she was thrown over my way, and we became good friends, and later got married. So we did some good caving in Virginia, Butler Cave, the Hanging Dong, that's called. Triple Well in Virginia, Newberry Baines. This is actually me doing my first and last bolt climb. I was not very good at it, but I didn't have any of these fancy hand drills. It was a roll drive that you hammered in, and I wasn't good at making a nice tight hole, apparently. And this was a 30-foot climb that I didn't reach the top of. But we had a project in those days. There was a cave in Bath County called Williams, and the military during World War II wanted practice in blowing caves shut for the campaign against the Japanese in the islands. And so they had blown this one shut in like 43 or so. And so the entrance area was known, and the grotto got permission from the landowner to open it up, and so we did. So it was really a pretty nice cave inside, you know, and very pristine since it had been closed all those years. And we mapped the thing. I think it ended up about 3 or 4 miles long, and it won Ward Fowler ribbon in one of the early cart salons. This was called the Snowman. Real pretty cave though, and we were lucky to basically have it to ourselves. And then of course, it wasn't far to West Virginia, and that's where we did most of our other project caving. And this was the door to the Sugar Shack, which is over near Dallas McKeever's old place. So a lot of our efforts in the early years were in the Friars Hole System. Everything was just exploding there because Doug Medville and other folks had made a dig and opened up a big trunk passage called the Highway, which had been connected to a bunch of other caves. And so, but Canadian Hole was the real wild and woolly part of it that had the giant monster cavern room, and on the right is the shot I got of the 120-foot waterfall. This is the window into Monster Cavern, and interestingly, Ron and I took this shot together, and he missed half the flash bulbs and the ones that I got, and in later years I put the two together and got the perfect shot. So just a few shots from the Friars Hole System, Crookshank entrance and passage, and Doug Medville on the left, who was always our inspiration and the coordinator of the project, and on the right is the sheep dip in Friars Hole. And a couple times we did the full through trip from Friars Hole to Canadian, and this was the least fun part of it. Camping at Gordon Matha's place, we were just around the corner from Snedeker's saltpeter, so we would often do evening photo trips into the cave. Some other parts of the system that were connected in, Toothpick. And this is Carol down in the Highway. And that's a typical passage in the Highway on the left. And what was unusual for West Virginia caves at that time was all the gypsum that was in it. You can see it all along the walls in this passage. And this thing actually was walking passage for, I think, a couple miles. So towards the end of my venue in my stay at UVA, we were planning a trip to Golondrinas, and Ron and I and Ward Fowler, we all chipped in on a 1,200-foot rope, and we took it to the gym and practiced with it. So this is at El Mirador. And this was back in the days when it was a lot of work to get to the cave. It was like a 12-kilometer hike. You had to cross a couple mountain ranges, and we paid this guy to carry the rope. And I'm sure it was some ridiculous low amount, but good wages for them at the time down there. And so, of course, everybody knows of Golondrinas. It's from the top of the rope there to the bottom, it's 1,097-foot free fall. And being that this was actually like beginning of late June, early July, the sun was coming directly into the pit. So if you do it other times a year, later in the year, the sunbeam isn't coming straight down, it's at an angle. So the sun comes down, and being that it's the rainy season, the floor is wet, so the sun will come down, hit the floor, and actually make a cloud inside. And we actually had 2 ropes because we ran into another group and we combined, they had a rope too. Actually, they had 2 short ropes, so they were really happy that we had a long rope. But So we rigged both, and some people had to cross a knot coming up, but everybody was able to rappel on the long rope. So this is an interesting shot because it looks like it's about a 100-foot pit, but Terry Raines made a postcard of this, and when I went to Golondrinas a few years back, lo and behold, in their signage for the pit, there was my picture. And not only that, I sold this picture and a picture of the swiftlets coming out of the cave to an ad agency, and hadn't known what happened to it, but Bob Montgomery sent me this picture from down in Mexico a few years back, and there it was in billboard size.
Was it Barcelona?
Oh, Barcelona, okay. I stand corrected, but what's interesting is how the scale of the climbers and the birds have been not quite matched up. So from UVA, Carol and I moved to, we packed up a U-Haul and moved entirely across the country because I had accepted a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara. And it was largely based on the fact that I had been doing, helping with sleep research at UVA. They had a sleep and dream laboratory. And I was paid to monitor subjects overnight, but wasn't doing any of my own research. But at UVA, I started doing studies it was funded by the Air Force, and it was effects of various factors on sleep, and exercise was the first thing. So we were an institute that had all sorts of machinery. We had treadmills, we could measure aerobic power, and so it was the first time anyone did a study on exercise and sleep where we actually controlled the exercise by aerobic power consumption. So, but in these studies, we would wire people with electrodes, and in this example, there's a sleep apnea measuring device, but we didn't include that. As you can see, it's uncomfortable enough without even that. So we would use a polygraph. We would record, on the top you see all the brain waves, and this pattern in the center is what you would see in deep sleep. They're slow delta waves. But then some of the most exciting sleep to watch, if you're watching the polygraph, is during rapid eye movement sleep. And in the rectangle there, you'll see the eyes are moving back and forth. And that's a sure signal that if you wake that person up, they're dreaming. But meanwhile, on the top line, the brain waves that you see during dream sleep look just like wakefulness. So we got the notion that the reason and what exercise did to sleep, especially really intense exercise, was it promoted more deep sleep. And we got the idea that that was facilitated by the increase in body temperature it afforded. So we had this giant underwater weighing tank, and they would usually heat it up so it was just comfortable for the subjects. But once I saw that the dial went up to like 106, I said, well, heck, this is a hot tub. And so I got my subjects and wired them up, and then they sat on this device, and I could lower them to a fixed level each time, to mid-chest. And one study, I woke people up in the middle of the night and did this to them. And another study, I exposed them to this procedure 4 different times a day on 4 different occasions. So what did I find? Well, if indeed, body heating also elicits an increase in deep sleep, but it depends when it's done. So basically, a late evening or just before sleep did have show an increase in deep sleep, but things early in the day didn't have much effect on it. But it has to really raise your body temperature. So I was at this research institute, and they were pretty good about letting me take leave without pay. So I took full advantage of that, and in 1982, a bunch of Southern Cal Grotto members put together a trip to Papua New Guinea. And this was like a 2-month trip, so it was by far the longest cave trip I'd ever gone on. And as we drove through the central highlands of New Guinea, we encountered a tribal sing-sing, and our driver stopped and asked if we could check it out. And this was definitely nothing for tourists. We were the only white people there, actually, but they were very tolerant of us running around taking pictures. Very interesting to watch, and they're beating the drums and swaying, and I wish I'd gotten some video, but I had left my cell phone at home. So we hired a few of these guys to be porters for us, and of course camp cooks and hut builders and all these other things that you need people to help you with. Some of us got in the spirit. Ernie Garza was one of my great friends in that era and throughout the rest of his lifetime. And this was the camp that we built. It was a pretty deluxe camp, really. Over on the right is the loo over a sinking stream, and I don't think we ever got into the cave it fell into, fortunately. So this was an example of one of our huts, and of course the reason we're off the ground is, we're there in the dry season, but that just means it only pours every afternoon instead of all day. And then, of course, there were all the critters that could crawl up and get you. So there were all these alpine clearings there, which made it a lot easier to look for caves. And all of them seemed to have these big limestone massifs. So we found a few good things. We found, this was Surprise River Cave. And we found another cave that we humbly named Number One Ananda, which means the best cave. And we called this the Jailbreak Passage. Just a very pretty cave. Nice cave pearls. You might recognize this as one I added an eyeball to later. Lots of pearls. So little did we know, a whole other team was up on a much higher mountain finding really sporting caves. And so who knows if we really had the number one cave. Okay, well, along this same era, in fact, about the same year, Carol and I started the California Sea Cave Survey, and the inspiration was really Halliday's Caves of California that had all these references to big sea caves along the coast. So no one had, as far as we knew, no one had ever bothered really mapping sea caves. So of course we had to have a logo, and Carol and Bob Richards put this one together. Later I replaced the seal with a mermaid. And I got really into it with a custom license plate. So we did a lot of trips along the coast. You had to go at low tide because that's when you could be the surest of accessing the cave. But even then, sometimes you had to rappel or swim. And our efforts ranged from actually Baja California to San Diego was one of our early things. These are the 7 caves of La Jolla. Turned out there's actually only 6 because several of these entrances connect. But here's an example of just why you need to go at a low tide, because everything you see in this picture would be underwater in high tide. And we had some interesting vertical caves in the Santa Cruz area. But the real highlight of all this was caving in the Channel Islands. And I could basically look out of my office at UCSB and see Santa Cruz Island here. Most graduate students would have been so jealous for the offices we had on the 6th floor of a building overlooking the ocean. So also next to Santa Cruz Island is Anacapa Island, and we had efforts in both. So I bought a boat so I could do this project, because we tried going out on a charter boat and to survey some caves, and they wouldn't even let us get in the water. So it was like, okay, I guess I need a boat. So I bought it, and I named it the Island Caver. And it was a 20-foot power boat. It had a V8 engine, and we could get out there in about an hour. This was my partner in those years, Juna Bewley. Some of you probably knew her, and she's moved on to Bali right now. But we had some interesting encounters with seals. And even though we had the big boat, we had to get to the caves. Usually we would anchor off the coast fairly close, because at Santa Cruz Island the water was very deep, and so we would take sea kayaks and enter the caves. And we wore some interesting get-ups in those days. We didn't have all the cool LED lights we have now. But the islands were a beautiful place to work. Arguably, this is the biggest cave entrance in the western US. It's 250 feet high, and we called it the Blimp Hanger. Another previously known cave was Cueva Valdez. But the granddaddy of them all is Painted Cave, and all this coloration is really due to minerals, even though the storybooks about it said it was painted by the Indians. But all these caves are in basalt, and they're formed on faults, and you can really see the fault is pretty evident here. So this thing had this big passage, 120 feet high, that went in for 600 feet. Then it got low. And looking back at somebody else's boat outside. And now these are in the inner chamber, which is the darkest place I've ever been in a cave, because as bright a light as you could bring in, the water just sucked up all the light. But on the left, you see the light coming through that entrance passage, and these are flashbulb pictures. And another shot looking the other way, and you can really, the reason that it made a room inside is because the fault along the entrance hit another one at a right angle, and so it suddenly got a lot wider once you got in here. So we did it was an epic thing early on to do a survey of this cave, and Ernie Garza launching some helium balloons to measure the height of the ceiling. And here's Bob Richards' lovely map. I think we had something like 1,227 feet, it says on there. And years later, I had sold the boat, but the project has been going on like intermittently with other people's boats when we can do it. And just a couple years ago, we rented a sailboat to go out there. But I produced my first 2 books on these sea caves. They were done by a local publisher in the area. But for each of these islands, we had over 100 caves surveyed. And I think on Santa Cruz Island, when I added up all the survey, there was over 5 miles of passage that we'd surveyed. And then recently, I've revised the first book to be full color, and I've added the 16 caves or so that we've surveyed since, and still haven't published this one yet, though. So then I had to take another leave without pay for a month, and I went to the Chiquibul in Belize. And this was funded by National Geographic. So we camped in this chamber called the Chiquibul Chamber. And it was nice because at night you could just do photos and such, and you can see there's a blue thing there. That's one of our tents. You had to sleep in tents because the jungle was just outside, and some of those yucky things could get in there, like chagas bugs. But I took a lot of flash bulbs on this expedition, and this is a 15 flash bulb shot of the Katobe trunk, just this mile long or so sandy floored passage. Very old cave, lots of huge formations that had come down. We called this one the Guillotine. This was a trip that Tom Miller organized. And yeah, these caves had had a lot of use by the Maya, and they had left pottery in a lot of them. And usually the pottery they left was always cracked. I think that was part of a ritual that they would do with them. And then we climbed, we found a flowstone wall with steps carved in it, and we climbed up it, and we found this pair of Mayan oyas that, you know, presumably had been probably left around 900 AD at the latest, and one was completely filled with a stalagmite. And there were things like blind white crabs. And one day I was out surveying way down a passage, and I saw one of these in a white rimstone pool full of crystals, and it just had National Geographic written all over it. And I didn't have a camera, so I returned the next day. It took hours, and of course it was gone. And there was a beautiful room called the Loltoon Room with these splattermite formations. And we crossed the border into Guatemala and found another entrance to the system. I think this was called Chiquibul. And this is a Mayan wall that had been left, and you see a lot of this kind of stuff there. Well, and of course in this era, around 1986, I was lucky to get in on a very early trip to Lechuguilla. Mostly thanks to this gentleman, Donald Davis. I don't know if he was on the first trip, but we did a lot of trips with him. And but on this trip, we entered deep secrets. This was before all these different branches of the cave were known. And we went down into this mammillary area and found this lake, and this is Lake Louise. And what was really significant about this was there was, aside from the entrance, no one had found any water in the cave, so you had to carry all your own water. And this is actually the Louise that Lake Louise was named after. So I made a lot of trips to Lechuguilla. Like I probably went on at least 12 to 15 week-long trips, but the highlight for me was some of the diving I got to do. And on one trip, our team found this lake, what I named myself the Lake of the Blue Giants, because we looked down in the water, and those things you see down there are underwater stalagmites. So I got permission from the park to do a solo cave dive in it. And this is me getting ready to go down. And we actually redid this dive for National Geographic, who came a couple years later. And Nick Nichols, actually their photographer, came, and I spent days training him in the local swimming pool to dive, because he was going to take pictures of me while I was underwater. And we get into the cave, and he takes one look at the pool and says, "I'm not going in there." So all his pictures were taken from floating on top, and I went down into the thing, and he had these strobes that they were like the second-rate strobes, so they wanted to float back up to the surface. And So I had to tie them on the stalagmites to keep them underwater. But he loaned me his fancy camera, and I got some nice underwater shots. So as far as I know, these are the only shots taken in this part of the cave underwater. So part of the deal with National Geographic was, I said, well, I'll come and do this, but there's this other lake around the corner that I would like to dive in. So they actually managed to get their people to haul me some 80 cubic foot tanks down here. And this lake is known as Stud Lake. It's not far from the other one. And this is a Nick Nichols shot of me preparing to go in. And the only picture I have of it, and the interesting stuff, is these are some underwater halictites that I found as I submerged. And to my knowledge, these are actually pretty unique compared to every other type of subaqueous halictite I've ever seen. So I didn't do a fancy survey, but I did string my line out, and where the line ended, I put a knot so I could at least measure how far I had gone. But when I saw the map of Lech, I noticed they hadn't even acknowledged that I had done any diving in there, so I sketched in what I had done and sent it back to them. So whether they use it or not, I don't know, but maybe someday somebody will return to those lakes and do a proper survey. So the third dive I got to do was at the lakes of Castrovalva. And this is, I think, of all the places I've been under the earth, this is one of the most spectacular. We accessed it in a raft, and it's just got gorgeous stuff in it. Horseshoe rimstone, cut out portions of the floor, beautiful women. And this is what she wore, because we had to, that one with the raft was a later shot. We had to swim in initially. This is sort of the inner chamber of it all, and it's very bizarre because that entire floor is a giant shelf stone, and then it drops about another 6 feet into the water. So for this dive, the park required that I had a buddy, and who better than Ron, who had become quite a cave diver since I had moved away. And so we came and we got a bunch of Virginia cavers to help haul the gear. And this time I brought my own underwater camera, and the first thing we saw as we went underwater were mammillary clusters that were dipping down into the water. And this was actually a shot Ron got of me going between two lakes that were considered two separate lakes until we connected them. But this one also had stalagmites, and I don't think anyone had noticed that these were under the water. And I think they're covered in mammillaries, and so I coined the term mammillagmites for them. But you see the small lake at the bottom of this map by Hazel Barton and the bigger lake above it. Well, basically, we connected those two portions underwater, but the lake didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. So then let's see, it was time to change universities again. I moved up to UC Santa Cruz and got a postdoc doing, of all things, sleep research. So UC Santa Barbara has, it's on the coast, or Santa Cruz rather, also on the coast, lots of sea caves. And initial project there was, there were a lot of caves being found in Sequoia National Park, mostly by Joel Despain and other folks. And they were generally closed to cavers, but they needed someone to photo document them. And so they twisted my arm, and I said, well, if you insist. And so I was lucky to get to go to a bunch of these caves, and this is called the Pumpkin Palace. And this is actually a more modern shot I took just a few years ago. But the whole area behind those formations is a giant pool basin with things like these pendulates, or maybe you'd call them stalactiflats. But just a gorgeous cave, and of course, totally pristine. That they had dug into this cave, so it was all virgin. More pendulates. And then an ongoing project that was not a closed cave, although it was research only, was Lilburn Cave. And I got into the resurvey of that fairly early on, before a lot of the old cave had been rediscovered. And they were looking for this river passage that had been known years ago. It didn't have a name, but our team ended up rediscovering it, and I gave it the name the Enchanted River. So it was just a gorgeous, completely mud-free, stream-washed passage. There's this waterfall you have to climb down. Another shot from the top of it. Gorgeous marble, some of the nicest marble I've seen in a cave. And then the last of these great sequoia caves that was found later in this whole sequence was Ursa Minor, named after a bear skeleton that had been found in it. And again, it was a cave that had not been known. Some people from my neck of the woods actually dug it open. And, it was just full of gorgeous stuff. So I got to do photo documentation in there for, I think we did 3 or 4 trips. And it's vertical, about a 90-foot drop. And this was actually, unbeknownst to me, I later was at the park and found a postcard they had made with my pictures. I'm not even sure I was credited, but just a beautiful cave, lots of pristine white, and lots of nice crystal pools. And this one was circulated a lot. It ended up in a lot of newspapers and press releases. So, well, of course, it was time for another expedition. These are probably all out of sequence, but I'm still at the same place. So we went to Borneo a couple times. And so the deal was, everyone's heard of Gunung Mulu National Park. You know, some of the biggest cave passage in the world. Well, there was another mountain just to the south called Buddha that basically had the same geology, but no one had checked for caves. So this was a project to explore that mountain. So there was weird stuff in these caves, and as a photographer, I'm always attracted to document weird stuff, and this is a showerhead formation. And some of the coolest speleogens I've ever seen are in these caves, and most likely the etiology of these is all the guano that's left by the bats and the swiftlets eats into the limestone here. And so that last place we named the Pinnacle Palace. But these are not caves you want to fall in. And there was lots of life. Spiders, centipedes, things that you didn't want to mess with. But actually one of the more benign, at least to humans, was the cave racer. We sat 2 feet away from this guy for quite a while, and he barely moved, but these things can snatch a flying critter out of the air quite deftly. But we mapped, I don't know how many kilometers, lots of them. And there were vertical caves too that were wet. And there were river caves, and we had all this stuff donated, like not a lot of money, but a lot of gear. And they had donated 2 boats to us, so thank God we found a cave to use them in. And very weird hydrology going on there. These are some kind of tubes carrying water down to the lower levels. So after these 2 expeditions, we made a report on each, and this was actually my first hand at public putting together things, laying them out, and I did the pictures digitally without making halftones. And when the NSS News came up, this gave me a lot of street cred for being prepared to deal with it. So another thing I started in this time period was the first of many trips to the Hawaiian Islands to map lava tubes. And it started off with a trip volcanospeleology conference in Hawaii. Bill Halliday had organized it. And we had like 40 people on a bus, and up on Mauna Loa, we stopped at a little cave, and people were trying to take turns to look at a few little crystals. And I said, heck with this, what else is on this flow? And I ran down about 10 minutes and found this other cool cave. I mean, the cave they were all looking at had about 3 or 4 of these things. And so I was like, wow. This is like the lechugia of lava tubes when you're used to dark lava tubes. And so it had this weird, what I ended up calling dendritic pohoihoi that I hadn't seen anywhere else. And I made one of my first maps of a cave here, and actually entered it in the map salon, and I think it might have even won a ribbon of some kind. But of course it's for the pictures and not for the cartography, but I made sure I got everything in there that it was supposed to have. But now I leave the cartography to people like Doug Medville and Bob Richards, and they're going to do a much better job, and I can just focus on pictures. This is Doug. This was actually an NSS News cover. Doug Medville here is sitting under a giant lava ball, and it looks like a scene out of an Indiana Jones movie, like he ought to be running forward, but it's firmly wedged. So we did a bunch of stuff over the years in the Kazumura system. Kazumura, as you probably know, it's the longest lava tube on Earth and the deepest. And it's got dozens of rope drops in it. And this one drops to a big lake called Eureka Falls. More of the Kazumura Passage. This is the top of the tallest drop. It's close to 70 feet. Lots of nice features in it. And another big cave system I got involved in was amassing, which is, it's in a different flow, but it starts up on Mauna Loa too. And some work in the south part of the island, down Kulakai system. But my favorite flows were always on Mauna Loa. And in this flow we call, well, if I gave the name of the flow, that would give it away. So it's up on Mauna Loa. And this is on Mauna Loa in a cave called Big Red. It's over a mile long, and the red floor extends all the way through it. But I've really come to love lava tubes. There's so much variety to the features in them. And lots of color, lots more color than you ever imagine if you haven't been in a Hawaiian lava tube. I went on took some filmmakers there, and While they were ditzing around, I grabbed a selfie. And one other cave I did map is this one we called Pele's Water Cave. So around, I guess it was close to summer of '96, I was asked if I was interested in doing the NSS News. And I was actually unemployed at that moment. I said, "What does it pay?" And they go, "Oh, maybe $900 a month." And I said, "Okay, I'm sold." And so I took it over, and I just happened to have an article on my diving in Lechuguilla that I hadn't sent to the editors yet. And as soon as I caught wind of this, I said, "I'm saving it for my first issue." So just to compress all this into 2 slides, this is every cover that I made. So all in all, I made 317 issues of the News. So the biggest change I introduced right away was going to a full color cover every month, and instead of doing half-tone pictures where you had to shoot a picture of a picture, and it became an all digital publication. So the photo quality went up right away. Just that change in technique was important. So another project that we did that wasn't directly in caves was to create a website. This was something that Juna Bewley and I started in '96 or so, or maybe even a couple years before, in the early days of the internet. And it was meant to be an educational site on caves. So we got this great diagram from Cave Minerals of the World, and I made an image map out of it so you could click on a type of formation and go to a page about it. And this is 4 separate pages I put into one image, but each page had a short sort of layperson description and a few pictures that started off with just 1 or 2 per page, but over the years I added more. And I visited a cave during that time where we got to shoot the world's longest soda straw that was 9 meters long. So I said, well, there's a long cave list of the world. How about a longest speleothems thing? And so I made one for the virtual cave. And as far as I know, there's nothing else out there where people keep a tally of the longest formations. So I've tried to keep this up to date over the years. So for a while I had it was linked on the NSS site, but when it was redesigned, Pete Johnson thought that it would be good if the virtual cave became a more integral part of the site. And I had originally given it to them to link because I didn't want it to go away when I died. It was too much work. And so now through his efforts, and I've been refining it, it's now an integral part of the website. And this is how a sample page on it looks. And so the pictures are bigger on the page, and when you click on them, they get even bigger. But there's a solution cave, there's a lava tube section. And then towards the end of my era there, I met this wonderful woman, Elizabeth. And I met her at a party, and we were chatting, and she said she really liked outdoor stuff and climbing around and stuff, but she didn't like being out in the sun. So I said, I have just the sport for you. So we started dating, and within a couple years we were married. And my little cabin in the Santa Cruz Mountains was not big enough, so we moved to our final destination, Angels Camp, which is it's a mining town on the west slopes of the Sierras in California. And it had actually been the site of the '75 NSS convention. And even though I went to most conventions, I didn't make that one. So there's mining relics and quaint little things. And that's my house in the upper right. How are we doing on time? Huh?
About 5 minutes.
Oh.
Or, yeah, till 12 or 1:30.
Oh. We probably have more, 10 minutes, but so this area, one of the reasons I chose it was because there's a whole bunch of limestone there, and there's a bunch of show caves, like 4 of them within an hour of my house. So this is Moaning Cave that has it drops 180 feet, and they offer an adventure trip with a rappel. California Caverns. This is Mercer Caverns, with whom I do a lot of work now. But a highlight was Black Chasm Cavern, and Hazel Barton had moved up to that area, I think at UC Davis, and we initiated a survey of this cave. And you can see why I was excited about this cave. It's a national natural landmark because of all the halictites in here. So surveying the cave meant we got to go everywhere in the cave. And it turns out there's a lot of halictites. And it was already being developed for tourism by the time we did this. We did find some, it had mostly been explored, but we found some new areas like this Chamber of Secrets. And it had, besides the halictites, really bizarre stuff like this has hexagonal pool spar on the top. And lots of really cool spar throughout. Lots of vertical. Again, the tourists don't get to see these parts. And so Hazel produced this awesome map from our work. And the cross-section really shows some of those drops you just saw. Oh, and of course it was time to go on another expedition. This was a river cave 6 kilometers long in Laos. So it was another National Geo expedition. So that meant they paid for a bunch of it, but not all of it by any means. So yeah, we brought all these rafts, and my only mission was to take pictures for 10 days. So how could I turn that down? And we had boats. Some days we only had 2 boats, so I had to get out on land to shoot pictures. But some pictures had to be done from a boat, so that meant we needed 4 boats, of course. 2 boats for flashers, 1 for a model, and 1 to shoot from. So lots of gorgeous stuff in there. This is the biggest passage, and I had brought a couple screw-base flash bulbs for this. Lots of huge rimstones, and this rimstone on the right is a portion of what I'm calling the world's largest rimstone basin. It's 61 meters long, a single pool. You came out the far end when you did the through trip of 6 kilometers. So we did everything from a base camp on the other end. And there's all the stuff I used to shoot these pictures. So while caving in Asia, just a few, as we get to the end here, I went to Hang Son Doong and took a few pictures there. But the big stalagmite there is arguably the tallest in the world now, because you're not even seeing all of it. And that mass you see in the center there is the same you see in this picture. And this was a trip for pay. I mean, not me paying them. And it's a pricey trip. It's like $3 grand to go to this cave. But I thought it was money well spent. And actually, this picture made me $500, so at the International Congress this year. So just a few shots, another highlight of my recent years in my elderly status of my 60s, getting to go to Double Bopper in the Grand Canyon to do photos. They were all sure I probably was too old to do this trip, but I think I handled it just fine. So it's definitely one of the world's premier helictite caves. I also took stereo pictures of all this stuff. And then even more recently, I got to help in Roaring Spring, which is the water supply for the the whole Grand Canyon, actually. So it was really special to get to go in there. And then I made, during this era, I've made 4 NSS books. The 2 on top are both directly related to the virtual cave segments. The one in the lower left from of course, the river cave, and then one on the natural bridges, which is a cave in mine, just down the road from where I live. So I'll whip through these quickly, but it's because we're almost done. I've been to these photo trips in France that are put on. They just invite cave photographers to come, and they take us to cool caves to take pictures. And I'd always wanted to see the blue and green caves. So these are like some bucket list photos. And interestingly, my wife doesn't always want to go caving, but she picks her trips carefully, but she has never missed a trip to France. And proof that she is in the caves. These are called the ravioli pearls. And so, my final 3 slides, my future plans. If you can interpret this, the idea is I don't want to become an armchair caver. So I'm going to keep caving as long as my body lets me. And I take a lot of pains to make sure it's going to last. I want to travel the world and see lots of cool stuff. And now that I'm retired from the news, I have more time to do that. I want to see more of the world's great caves. You know, you get to a lot of other countries and the caving is a lot easier than it is in West Virginia. And then finally, I have a few book projects I want to finish. I want to make one called 50 Years Under the Earth. It's just all about the coolest caves I've seen. One called Dangerous Beauties Inside the Great Sea Caves of the World. And that'll be sort of the end of the virtual cave trilogy. And then finally, 40 years in the making, or maybe 50, the erotic underground. It will happen, I promise. And that's it. Okay. Are there any questions, comments, or obscene remarks?
I have a question. Did you have, is your wife Beth?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, okay. But did you have you mentioned another wife earlier? Is that
Carol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something happened in between, but I can assure you every ex I ever had is still a good friend.
Okay, that's good. I just was a little bit...
Make sure to repeat the questions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll repeat the question if there's more questions. Are there any others?
Great.
Okay, then.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Good job.
Thanks.